Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe.
Howdy folks, and welcome to the Tank Museum at Bovington, where I've been asked to come down and list my 5 worst tanks of all time. I was actually asked to come down and do this around about 18 months ago, shortly after Britain went into its first lockdown, so I eventually made it here 18 months later, and here we are. The thing is, when you're looking at a list of the worst 5 tanks in the world, you kind of first have to decide what is it that makes a tank good in the first place, and how do your worst 5 tanks manage to avoid checking off all those boxes. So the holy trinity in tank design has pretty much always been trying to strike a balance between firepower, armour and mobility. It's very, very difficult to manage to tick all 3 of those boxes at the same time. There's almost always some kind of trade-off. If you manage to get 2 out of the 3, you've probably got a pretty good tank. If you manage to get 1 out of the 3, you've probably got a pretty bad tank. But in some cases, people have actually managed to get none out of the 3, and at least a few of those are going to be on our list today. And so we come to, well, among the first 2 of my top 5 worst tanks, which technically, you'd be quite correct in pointing out, aren't actually tanks in the first place. In fact, they barely qualify as armoured vehicles at all. But they're on display at the Tank Museum, so I'm going to take them. Starting off at number 5, we have the Thornycroft Bison, which is basically a truck with a concrete bunker on the back. And it is exactly as bad as it looks. The story behind this, in 1940, the British Army was probably the most heavily mechanised army in the world. Unfortunately, then Dunkirk happened, and we had to leave pretty much all of our equipment on the beaches of France. At that point, the British Army, it was fairly safe to say, was on the bones of its arse. And so a number of companies volunteered designs to make do in the meantime. Things like this were one of them. It is literally just a truck with a concrete bunker on the back. As such, it has terrible armour. With the weight of all that concrete, it has 0 mobility, and the firepower is limited to whatever rifles you can stick out of the firing ports. So it absolutely fails in all 3 of the criteria that go towards making a serviceable tank. And for that reason, I'm very proud to have the Thornycroft Bison at number 5 on my list of the top 5 worst tanks ever. Welcome to number 4 on the list, where we've moved into the Vehicle Conservation Centre, which is thankfully a lot more quiet. And I am sitting on top of the experimental machine gun carrier, also known as the Praying Mantis, which was a kind of bizarre choice because the British Army at the time had the perfectly adaptable, reliable and versatile Bren gun carrier, which was a great piece of kit, did the job it was supposed to do and many, many more jobs besides. But then somebody had the bright idea, yes, but what if we could do better? And failed because this is what they came up with. It's difficult to actually visualize what this thing looked like, because here in the VCC it's packed in the stowed away position. But it had a crew of 2 who would lie on their bellies in this bit here. The only visibility they had were a couple of tiny visibility ports there and over there, and for some bizarre reason, because remember they were lying flat on their stomachs facing that way, there were a couple of tiny little hatches in the back which are absolutely no use whatsoever to anybody. This thing would be armed with a pair of Bren guns. And remember, the Bren fires from a 30-round box magazine, so reloading was going to be fun. And the idea was that this whole thing could extend up, hence the nickname Praying Mantis. But nobody bothered to stop and ask the question, why? Nobody asked for it, nobody needed it, and after they built this prototype, they realised that nobody wanted it. And so this is the only example that was ever made, and thank God for that, because it must have been just a nightmare to crew and attempt to fight in, and definitely deserves the position of number 4 on my list. Coming in at number 3 on my list of 5 worst tanks is the M3 Lee. Although the Tank Museum doesn't have an M3 Lee, it has the next worst thing, the M3 Grant, the British version. Technically not actually that bad a tank. I mean, it certainly wasn't great, but at the time when it was introduced and saw action in the North African campaign, it was a significant improvement over the tanks that the British were using at the time. It was very much appreciated by the tank crews. It had a perfectly serviceable 37mm gun that fired an armour-piercing shot that was more or less capable of dealing with any tanks that it was likely to face. And the crews also very much appreciated the 75mm gun, which had something that most British tanks in the North African desert at the time didn't have: a very, very good high explosive shell, perfect for taking out bunkers, machine gun posts and anti-tank guns. Also, a fairly decent armour-piercing shell for those occasions when the 37mm gun wasn't up to the job. The Russians didn't like it much. They called it the coffin for 7 brothers, but it wasn't actually that bad a tank, and it did a sort of stopgap job until the M4 Sherman could be developed and pushed into service. So what's it doing on my list? I absolutely hate playing this thing in World of Tanks. It completely sucks. And for that reason, and that reason alone, it's going on my list. Well, we're back in the Vehicle Conservation Centre for number 2 on my list of the 5 worst tanks of all time, and we are with the Churchill Black Prince. The Churchills were actually fairly good tanks. I mean, the Mark I wasn't much, but by the time they got to the Mark III and the Mark IV, they were fairly reliable, well armoured, decent gun, terrible mobility, of course. But then we came to the Churchill Black Prince, which was kind of strange because, remember, the holy trinity of tank design: mobility, firepower, and armour. And it definitely had the armour. And at first glance, it might appear that it had the firepower. This is just a 17-pounder gun, and this thing was being developed at around about the time when they were building Centurions with 20-pounder guns, so it didn't even really have the firepower. The mobility, of course, was absolutely diabolical because all they did was add a whole bunch of armour to it, but they didn't bother upgrading the engine, so it could barely outpace a walking soldier. And when the mobility is that bad, the armour is meaningless because you just outflank it and shoot it in the sides. So this tank was pretty much an all-round unmitigated disaster and definitely deserves its position at number 2 on my list of top 5 worst tanks. And so here it is, the moment you've all been waiting for, my worst tank in my top 5. And it's probably going to be a slightly controversial choice because it is, of course, the Mighty Tog II, which made it to number 1 in my list of the 5 best tanks. The thing is, I didn't place it at number 1 in my list of 5 best tanks because it was actually any good. I placed it at number 1 in my list of 5 best tanks because it was bloody terrible. It's just so gloriously, eccentrically, Britishly bad. And for that reason, it definitely deserves a place on the top of my worst 5 tanks ever. This was a tank that was designed by a World War I committee in order to fight the First World War in the 1940s. They kind of missed the window on that one by at least 2 decades. It is a gloriously bad tank, and I love it to bits, and it absolutely deserves its position at number 1 on my list of the 5 worst tanks ever. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. I'd like to thank the Tank Museum for inviting me down and eventually getting here 18 months after they first asked me down in order to film this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Tank Museum's YouTube channel. Remember, they are a charity. If you wish to support them, you can support them on Patreon, or in a shameless act of product placement, perhaps buy the Tog II Super Heavy Tank Kit from Covey on the Tank Museum's online shop, or in person if you want to come down and visit them, because they are once again open to the public. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.
We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.